Okay, hello guys. So, continuing the Moby Dick, Chapter 4, The Counterpane. Upon waking up next morning about daylight, I found Queequeg's arm thrown over me in the most loving and affectionate manner. You had almost thought I had been his wife. The counterpane was of patchwork, full of odd little party-colored squares and triangles, and this arm of his tattooed all over with an interminable cretin labyrinth of a figure. No two parts of which were of one precise shade, owing I suppose to his keeping his arm at sea unmethodically in sun and shade. His shirt sleeves irregularly rolled up at various times. The same arm of his, I say, looked for all the like looked for all the world like a strip of that same patchwork quilt. Indeed, partly lying on it, as the arm did when I first awoke, I could hardly tell it from the quilt. They so blended their hues together, and it was only by this sense of weight and pressure that I could tell that Queequeg was hugging me. My sensations are strange. Let me try to explain them. When I was a child, I remember a somewhat similar circumstance that befell me. Whether it was a reality or a dream, I never could entirely settle. The circumstances was this. I had been cutting up some capering or other. I think I was trying to crawl up the chimney as I had seen a sweep do a few days previous, and my stepmother, who somehow or other was all the time whipping me or sending me to bed supperless. My mother dragged me by the legs out of the chimney and packed me off to bed, though it was only 2 o'clock in the afternoon of the 21st June, the longest day in the year in our hemisphere. I felt dreadfully, but there was no help for it, so upstairs I went to my little room in the dirt floor, undressed myself as slowly as possible so as to kill time, and with a bitter sigh got between the sheets. I lay there dismally, calculating that 16 entire hours must elapse before I could hope for a resurrection. 16 hours in the bed. The small of my back ached to think of it. And it was so light too, the sun shining at the window and the great rattling of coaches in the street, and the sound of gay voices all over the house. I felt worse and worse. At last I got up, dressed, and softly going down in my stockinged feet, sought out my stepmother, and suddenly threw myself at her feet, beseeching her as a particular favor to give me a good slippering for my misbehavior. Anything indeed but condemning me to lie abed such an unendurable length of time. But she was the best and most conscientious of stepmothers, and back I had to go to my room. For several hours I lay there broad awake, feeling a great deal worse than I have ever done since, even from the greatest subsequent misfortunes. At last I must have fallen into a troubled nightmare of doze, and slowly wakened from it. Half steeped in dreams, I opened my eyes, and before sunlit room was now wrapped in outer darkness. Instantly I felt a shock running through all my frame. Nothing was to be seen, and nothing was to be heard, but a supernatural hand seemed to place it in mine. My arms hung over the counterpane, and the nameless, unimaginable, silent form or phantom to which the hand belonged seemed closely seated by my bedside. For what seemed ages piled on ages, I lay there, frozen with the most awful fears, not daring to drag away my hand, yet ever thinking that if I could but stir it one single inch, horrified spell would be broken. I knew not how this consciousness at last glided away from me, but waking in the morning, I shudderingly remembered it all, and for days and weeks and months afterwards I lost myself in the confounding attempts to explain the mystery. Nay, to this very hour I've often puzzled myself with it. Now, take away the awful fear, and my sensations at feeling the supernatural hand in mine were very similar in their strangeness to those which I experienced on waking up and seeing Queequeg's pagan arm drawn around me. But at length all the past night's events soberly recurred, one by one, in fixed reality, and then I lay only alive to the comical predicament. For though I tried to move his arm, unlock his bridegroom clasp, yet, sleeping as he was, he still hugged me tightly, as though naught but death should part us twain. I now strove to rouse him. Quick egg! But his only answer was a snore. I then rolled over, my neck feeling as if it were in a horse collar, and suddenly felt a slight scratch. Throwing aside the counterpane, there lay the tomahawk sleeping by the savage's side, as if it were a hatchet-faced baby. A pretty pickle, truly, thought I, a bed here in a strange house in a broad day, with a cannibal and a tomahawk. Quick egg, in the name of a goodness, quick egg, wake! At length, by dint of much wriggling and lound and incessant expostulations upon the unbecomingness of his hugging a fellow male in that matrimonial sort of style, I succeeded in extracting a grunt, and presently he drew back his arm, shook himself all over like a Newfoundland dog just from the water, and sat up in bed, stiff as a pikestaff, looking at me and rubbing his eyes as if he did not altogether remember how I came to be there, though a dim consciousness of knowing something about me seemed slowly dawning over him. Meanwhile, I lay quietly eyeing him, having no serious misgivings now, and bent upon narrowly observing so curious a creature. When at last his mind seemed made up touching the character of his bedfellow, and he became, as it were, reconciled to the fact, he jumped out upon the floor, and by certain signs and sound gave me to understand that, if it pleased me, he would dress first, then leave me to dress afterwards, leaving the whole apartment to myself. Thanks, Queequeg, under the circumstances, this is very civilized overture, but the truth is, these savages have an innate sense of delicacy. Say what you will, it is marvelous how essentially polite they are. I paid this particular compliment to Queequeg. Queequeg? Fuck this. Because he treated me with so much civility and consideration, while I was guilty of great rudeness, staring at him from the bed and watching all his toilet motions, for the time my curiosity getting the better of my breeding. Nevertheless, men like Queequeg you don't see every day. He and his way were well worth unusual regarding. He commenced dressing at top by donning his beaver hat, a very tall one, by the by, and then, still minus his trousers, he hunted up his boots. What under the heavens he did it for, I cannot tell, but his next moment was to crush himself, boots in hand, and hats on, under the bed, when from sundry violent grasping and strainings I inferred he was hard at work booting himself, though by no law of property that I ever heard of is any man required to be private when putting on his boots. But Queequeg, do you see, was a creature in the transition state, neither caterpillar nor butterfly. He was just enough civilized to show off his outlandishness in the strangest possible manner. His education was not yet complete. He was an undergraduate. If he was not been a small degree civilized, he very probably would not have troubled himself with boots at all. But then, if he had not been still a savage, he never would have dreamt of getting under the bed to put them on. At last he emerged with his hat very much dented and crushed down over his eyes, and began creaking and limping about the room, as if, not being much accustomed to boots, his pair of damp, wrinkled, cowhide ones, probably not made to order either, rather pinched and tormented him at the first go of the bitter cold morning. Seeing now that there were no curtains to the window, and that the streets were being very narrow, the house opposite commanded the plain view into the room, and observing more and more in the indecorous figure that Queequeg made, staving about with a little else but his hat and boots on, I begged him as well as I could to accelerate his toilet somewhat, and particularly to get into his pantaloons as soon as possible. He complied, and then proceeded to wash himself. At the time in the morning any Christian would have washed his face, but Queequeg, to my amazement, contented himself with restricting his ablutions to his chest, arms, and hands. He then donned his waistcoat, and taking up a piece of hard soap on the washstand center table, dipped it into water, commenced lathering his face. I was watching to see where he kept his razors, when lo and behold he takes the harpoon from the bed corner, slips out the long wooden stock, unsheaths the head, wets it on his boot, and striding up to the bit of mirror against the wall, begins a vigorous scraping, or rather harpooning of his cheeks. Thinks I, Queequeg, this is using Roger's best cutlery with a vengeance. Afterwards, I wondered the less at this operation when I came to know of what fine steel the head of harpoon is made, and how exceedingly sharp the long straight edges are always kept. The rest of his toilet was soon achieved, and he proudly marched out of the room, wrapped up in his great pilot monkey jacket and sporting his harpoon like a marshal's baton. Fuck. Chapter 5. Breakfast. I quickly followed suit, and descending into the bar, room accosted the grinning landlord very pleasantly. I cherished no malice towards him, though he had been skylarking with me not a little in the matter of my bedfellow. However, a good laugh is a mighty good thing, and whether too scarce a good thing, the more's the pity. So if any one man in his own proper person affords stuff for a good joke to anybody, let him not be backward, but let him cheerfully allow himself to spend and to be spent in that way. And the man that has anything bountifully laughable about him, be sure there is more in that man than you perhaps think for. The barroom was now full of boarders who had been dropping in the night previous, and whom I had not as yet had a good look at. They were nearly all whalemen, chief mates, and second mates, and third mates, and sea carpenters, and sea coopers, and sea blacksmiths, and harpooners, and shipkeepers, a brown and brawny company with bosky beards and unshorn, shaggy set, all wearing monkey jackets for morning gowns. You could pretty plainly tell how long each one had been ashore. This young fellow's healthy cheek is like a Santos of parent hue, and would seem to smell almost as musky. He cannot have been 3 days landed from his Indian voyage. That man next to him looks a few shades lighter. You might say a torch of satin wood is in him. In the complexion of a third still lingers a trophic tone, but slightly bleached withal. He doubtless has tarried whole weeks ashore. But who could show a cheek like Queequeg, which, barred with various tints, seemed like Andy's western slope, to show forth in one array, contrasting climates, zone by zone? Grub ho, now, cried the landlord, flinging open the door, and in we went to breakfast. They say that men who have seen the world thereby become quite at ease in manner, quite self-possessed in company. Not always, though. Ledyard, the great New England traveller, and Mungo Park, the Scotch one, of all men they possess the least assurance in the parlour. But perhaps the men crossing the Siberia in a sledge drawn by dogs as Ledyard did, or the taking long solitary walk on an empty stomach in the Negro heart of Africa, which was the son of poor Mungo's performances. This kind of travel, I say, may not be very best mode of attaining a high social polish. Still, for the most part, that sort of thing is to be had anywhere. These reflections just here are occasioned by the circumstance that after we were all seated at the table, and I was preparing to hear some good stories about whaling, to my no small surprise, nearly every man maintained a profound silence. And not only that, but they looked embarrassed. Yes, here were a set of sea dogs, many of whom without the slightest bashfulness had boarded great whales on the high seas, entire strangers to them, and duelled them dead without winking. And yet, here they sat at a social breakfast table, all of the same calling, all of the kindred tastes, looking round as sheepishly at each other as though they had never been out of sight of some sheepfold among the Green Mountains. A curious sight. These bashful bears, these timid warrior wildmen. But as for Queequeg, why? Queequeg sat there among them, at the head of the table too, it so chanced, as cool as an icicle. To be sure, I cannot say much of his breeding. His greatest admirer could not have cordially justified his bringing his harpoon into breakfast with him, and using it there without ceremony, reaching over the table with it, to the imminent jeopardy of many heads, and grappling the beefsteak towards him. But that was certainly very coolly done by him, and everyone knows that in the most people's estimation, to do anything coolly is to do it genteelly. We will not speak of all Queequeg's peculiarities here, how he eschewed coffee and hot rolls, and applied his undivided attention to beefsteaks, done rare. Enough, that when breakfast was over, he withdrew like the rest into the public room, lighted his tomahawk pipe, and was sitting there quietly digesting and smoking with his inseparable hat on when I sallied out for a stroll. Chapter 6. The Street. If I had been astonished at first catching a glimpse of so outlandish an individual as Queequeg circulating among the polite society of a civilized town, that astonishment soon departed upon taking my first daylight stroll through the street of New Bedford. In thoroughfares like the docks, any considerable seaport will frequently offer to view the curious-looking nondescript from foreign parts. Even in Broadway and Chestnut Street, Mediterranean marines will sometimes jostle the affrighted ladies. Regent Street is not unknown to Lascars and Malays, and at Bombay, in the Apollo Green, live Yankees have often scared the natives. But New Bedford beats all Water Street and Wapping. In these last mentioned haunts you see only sailors, but in New Bedford actual cannibals stand chatting at street corners, savages outright, many of whom yet carry on their bones unholy flesh. It makes a stranger stare. But besides the Fijians, Tongotabors, Eromangons, Panangians, I'm sorry about that, and Brygians, and besides the wild specimen of whaling craft which unheeded reel about the streets, you will see other sights still more curious, certainly more comical. There weekly arrive in this town scores of green Vermonters and New Hampshire men, all athirst for gain and glories in the fishery. They are mostly young, of stalwart frames, fellows who have felled forest and now seek to drop the axe and snatch the whale lands. Many are as green as the green mountains whence they came. In some things you would think them but a few hours old. Look there, that chap strutting round the corner. He wears a beaver hat and swallow-tailed coat, girdled with a sailor belt and a sheath knife. Here comes another with a sou'wester and a bombazine cloak. What the fuck is that? No town-bred dandy will compare with the country-bred one. I mean, downright bumpkin dandy. A fellow that, in the dog days, will mow his 2 acres in buckskin clothes for fear of tanning his hands. Now, when a country dandy like this takes it into his head to make a distinguished reputation and joins the great whale fishery, you should see the comical things he does upon reaching the seaport. In bespeaking his sea outfit, he orders bell-buttons to his waistcoat, straps to his canvas trousers. Ah, poor hayseed! How bitterly will burst those straps in the first howling gale, when thou art driven straps, buttons, and all down the throat of the tempest. But think not that this famous town has only harpooners, cannibals, and bumpkins to show her visitors. Not at all. Still, New Bedford is a queer place. Had it not been for us whalesmen, that tract of land would this day perhaps have been in the howling condition as the coast of Labrador. As it is, parts of her back country are enough to frighten one. They look so bony. The town itself is perhaps the dearest place to live in all New England. It is a land of oil, true enough, but not like Canaan. A land also of corn and wine. The streets do not run with milk, nor in the springtime do they pave them with fresh eggs. Yet, in spite of this, nowhere in all America will you find more patrician-like houses, parks, and gardens more opulent than in New Bedford. Whence came they? How planted upon this once scraggy scoria of a country? Go and gaze upon the iron emblematical harpoons round yonder lofty mansion, and your question will be answered. Yes, all these brave houses and flowery gardens came from the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. One and all, they were harpooned and dragged up hither from the bottom of the sea. Can Earth's Alexander perform a feat like that? In the New Bedford, fathers, they say, give whales for dowers to their daughters, and portions of their nieces with a few porpoises apiece. You must go to New Bedford to see a brilliant wedding, for they say they have a reservoir of oil in every house, and every night recklessly burn their lengths at the spermaceti candles. In summertime, the town is sweet to see, full of fine maples, long avenues of green gold. And in August, high in air, the beautiful and bountiful horse chestnuts, candelabra-wise, proffered the passerby their tapering upright cones of congregated blossoms. So omnipotent is art, which in many a district of New Bedford has superinduced bright terraces of flowers upon the Barton refuse rocks thrown aside at the creation's final day. And the women of New Bedford, they bloom like their own red roses. But roses only bloom in summer, whereas the fine carnation of their cheeks is perennial as sunlight in the seventh heavens. Elsewhere match that bloom of theirs ye cannot, save in Salem, where they tell me the young girls breathe such musk, their sailor sweethearts smell their miles offshore, as though they were drawing nigh at the odorous Moluccas instead of puritanic sands. Okay, so we'll end here today for now. I'll see you on the next one.